here in this idea of a motor unit. So a motor unit is where a single motor neuron attaches to a particular number of muscle fibers or muscle cells, right? So where if one motor neuron attaches to many muscle fibers or muscle cells simultaneously, then it's going to lead to a stronger contraction. If one motor neuron only attaches to one muscle cell or muscle fiber, it's going to be a much weaker contraction. We call these motor units. It's the idea of recruitment, so that your nervous system, when you want to control a muscle, you don't have to activate the entire muscle all at once, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, would you want to contract with full force the entirety of your muscle for everything you ever do? No, exactly. Like, what if you're gonna, I don't know, like write notes or something, or type on your computer? You wouldn't want to use all the potential muscle force just to type or to write notes, right? So there needs to be a way to control like fine motor movements and gross and more strong motor movements, right? This idea of a motor unit. So if a motor unit is where one neuron or motor neuron attaches to any given numbers of muscle fibers, then we call it the motor unit. So large motor units are going to be where you have one motor neuron attaching to many muscle fibers. So when that one motor neuron's active, you're going to activate lots of muscle fibers, which means you're going to get a stronger contraction. So you'd use larger motor units to, like, you know, weightlift and stuff. Small motor units. I was trying to think of an example that wasn't too ridiculous. Yeah. You'd use smaller motor units, which is where one neuron attaches to just a few muscle fibers or cells, and it's going to produce a weaker contraction. Can you guys imagine a circumstance where you might want to use like a small motor unit? I like that, yeah. Putting a thread through a needle, right? That takes a lot of like sort of fine motor control. And you want to just have nice little tiny contractions to get that thread right through the needle, right? Otherwise, if you use the full force of your muscles, like, you're never going to get that through. You're going to be like Hulk, like just frustrated, like, ah! So once that motor neuron is active, it will always lead to a contraction in a muscle cell. We call this an all or none principle, okay? So if you activate a motor neuron, it will lead to a muscle contraction. So what we're seeing here, guys, is different motor units. We got the blue and red ones. So we have one red motor neuron here. You can see that this axon branches out and attaches to multiple muscle cells, whereas the blue motor neuron here branches and only attaches to, you know, 2 muscle cells. So which motor neuron do you guys think would produce the most force?
The red.
Yeah, the red motor unit, right? And it's a larger motor unit. And then what would produce less force would be the blue one. It's a smaller motor unit because it attaches to less muscle cells. And it turns out you actually recruit the smaller motor units first. So when you go to like use a muscle, you start with the small motor units and then you work your way up to the large ones. And it makes sense, right? You wouldn't want to start with the large ones and then work your way to the small ones, because that means like if you're gonna like grab a coffee cup or something, you'd start with the full force of your muscle. Yeah, and then it would get weak, and then you can go like, oh, okay, good, right? That would be very effective to like drink coffee. Okay, so yeah. So you start with the smaller motor units first, and then you work your way up to larger ones. Makes sense. So there's also an idea of muscle tone. The physiological mechanism of muscle tone is different than what you guys hear about muscle tone, you know, like on TV or something. You hear about muscle tone like muscles being toned. Or like they'll sell you like devices to make your muscle tone, right? Like, oh, this will tone your muscle. Okay, now forget that. Okay, that has nothing to do with this mechanism. So the physiological mechanism of muscle tone is where muscle cells are always a little bit active. They're never fully relaxed. They're always a little bit active. There's slightly contracted because it keeps the muscle cells healthy. Always being like in a slight state of contraction. And it also prepares them and keeps them ready for a muscle contraction when it needs to occur. Okay? So muscle tone is actually a feedback mechanism where the tension of a muscle cell is measured by neurons, and then that actually goes to the spinal cord, and then that actually can activate another motor neuron that can excite the muscle cell to contract. And it's a constant or steady state of contraction that your muscle cells undergo, even when you think they're relaxed. Like if I have you guys like point to a muscle in your body, and even if you think it was relaxed and not currently contracting, it's actually still slightly a little contracted. That's muscle tone. And it's a way to keep muscle cells healthy and ready to contract. Okay. Now, there's two different types of muscle contraction. We have isometric and isotonic. Iso means the same. When you guys think of metric, what does that bring to mind? Yeah, distance, exactly. And then tonic means tone, like a steady state of something, right? So isometric means your muscles contracting but not changing length. Can you guys think of an example of like an isometric contraction? Where it's contracting but you're not changing the length of that muscle. So what we're seeing here, guys, she's able to pick it up, but if her muscle's not changing length, then we call that isometric. But if her muscle is contracting and it's shortening, we call that isotonic, specifically concentric. Good. And what about if she went back down and put it back down to resting position? Eccentric, but it's still isotonic. Good. Now, there's also different types of muscle fibers within muscle. Not all muscle cells are the same. We got slow oxidative, and fast glycolytic fibers. So oxidative phosphorylation is where your cells can use oxygen to help generate ATP, right? Glycolysis is a form of anaerobic respiration where our cells just make ATP in the absence of oxygen, okay? So if it's an oxidative type of fiber, it means it's relying heavily on oxygen supply. If it's glycolytic, it means it's not relying that heavily on oxygen, and instead relying on just ATP production in the absence of oxygen, okay? Now you might wonder, why have different types of fibers? Well, you use your muscles differently. Not all the muscles in your body you're going to use the same way, right? Like some muscles need to be really fast. You need to have like really powerful bursts of quick energy, right? Other muscles need to be more like endurance type of muscles, right? Like postural muscles need to be able to endure the length of an entire day of sitting upright or standing, right? So those would be more of the oxidative variety because they can produce a moderate amount of ATP over a long period of time, okay? Really quick bursts of energy where you can't really supply oxygen to your muscle tissue, that would be more like the glycolytic fiber, right? Because you don't need oxygen here, right? You're just producing ATP really quickly in the absence of oxygen. So what types of muscles do you guys think would be well suited for fast glycolytic fibers? Yeah, leg muscles, especially if you're a sprinter. Like if you trained yourself to sprint, really quickly, for a short period of time, you're going to find much more fast glycolytic fibers there. Or if you're a long distance runner, oxidative, slower, fast oxidative, right? But at least the oxidative variety, because if you're a long distance runner, then you can keep up with your ventilation and you can inhale oxygen and help to make ATP over a long period of time. So those are oxidative fibers. Now, if you have a glycolytic type of cell and muscle, do these cells need a whole lot of blood supply if they're not relying on oxygen? No, right? Because it's the blood that brings in the oxygen. So you're going to find less blood vessels in glycolytic fibers. You also find less myoglobin. Myoglobin is what gives meat that kind of brownish, reddish color. And so would you find a lot of myoglobin, if it holds oxygen, would you find a lot of myoglobin in glycolytic fibers? No. No. So glycolytic fibers are the white meat because white meat is what lacks myoglobin. And by not having myoglobin, the tissue looks more white. Red meat or dark meat has myoglobin, which is involved in storing oxygen, and that's more found in these oxidative fibers. So where do you find like white meat on an animal of some sort? Yeah, chest. Like I think like a bird, right? Like chicken breast is white meat. Well, what do chickens use their breast muscle for? Flapping their wings, right? And they can do really quick bursts to get away from a predator or something, right? So they have quick bursts of energy and they can flap away, but it's the fast glycolytic fibers. Why are they white? They don't have myoglobin. And so it has less myoglobin, so it makes it look more white. And then where do you find like red meat or dark meat? You mean like on the actual leg itself? I was thinking more like the trunk area. you'd have a lot of these oxidative fibers because they're better for endurance, things like postural support, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I guess not.
Now, what's interesting, you guys, is that these fibers can change type depending on how you use them. So if you change the way you use a muscle, you can change your fiber type. So like, let's say if you took up sprinting as a hobby, you could somehow generate not new fibers, but your fibers can change from one type to another. Like you can alter your oxidative fibers into the glycolytic variety. Or what if you went from sprinting to like long distance swimming? Well, then you can change your glycolytic fibers back into the oxidative variety. So it's kind of cool. So what this table here shows you guys is the comparison of these oxidative fibers and glycolytic fibers. Now, if it's slow versus fast, this refers to differences in the speed of the myosin head. So if your myosin heads contract more slowly, that'll make a slow fiber. If they contract more rapidly, that'll make a fast fiber. And so then these muscles will produce tension at varying rates. So slow oxidative fibers produce tension more slowly, right? Fast oxidative fibers produce tension more quickly. And it's all dependent on the speed of that myosin ATPase. Okay? Now, if it's oxidative, where's it going to get its ATP from? It's getting its ATP from mitochondria, which use oxygen to make that ATP, right? So we actually find that you have higher capacities to make ATP in these oxidative fibers. And then if it's glycolytic, you're getting ATP from glycolysis, which is a very limited form of ATP production. So basically, we break down sugar, and that gets you some ATP based on that sugar breakdown. But it doesn't require oxygen, so we call that anaerobic or glycolytic. Okay, so what about blood vessels in that muscle? Would you need a lot of blood vessels in the glycolytic variety? No, because you don't need as much oxygen supply to those tissues. What about oxidative? Yes, definitely. Good. How about the color of the tissue in the glycolytic variety? White, right? That's the white meat. And then what about if it's oxidative? Dark. It's red. You guys know it's red because myoglobin is rich in iron, and iron oxide looks red. That's why they call it Colorado, by the way, because our dirt here is really rich in iron. So it gives it the red color, which is also why our blood's red, because it has a lot of hemoglobin. Like myoglobin transports oxygen on iron. Now, what about contraction velocity? If it's a fast fiber, it's fast, yeah. And what does that relate to? If it's fast, what makes it fast? The speed of your myosin head, right? So it's the speed of the myosin ATPase, right? Now, you find these fibers in different areas. So you find slow oxidative fibers in muscles of the trunk, like postural muscles, because these they're better for endurance. Holding your trunk upright over the course of a day is an endurance activity. If this was a fast glycolytic variety, what that means then is you can hold your trunk upright really well for short periods of time, but then they would get fatigued and then you'd fall over. You'd have to wait there until your muscles weren't fatigued, and then you'd stand up again and be like, okay, I'm standing. This is good. And then you get fatigued and then you'd slump over again. So it makes sense to have a slow oxidative variety because it's better for endurance activities there. The slow oxidative fibers have the smallest diameter. The fast glycolytic fibers have the largest diameter, and it relates to the amount of myofibrils you find inside the cell. And if it's glycolytic, do you need mitochondria? We don't need as many, because remember, mitochondria use chemicals and oxygen to help make ATP. But if it's glycolytic, are you relying on oxygen? No, exactly. So then you don't need as many mitochondria in the glycolytic variety, which is also one of the reasons why they look more white, because they lack as much mitochondria, which look kind of brown, if that makes sense. And then where are you going to find a lot of myoglobin if it helps hold on to oxygen? Slow and fast oxidative, right? If they're oxidative, then they're using oxygen to make ATP. And so if it's slow oxidative, this is better suited for endurance. Fast oxidative is better suited for like medium duration things like walking, hiking. Fast glycolytic is better suited for quick bursts of energy. Think like sprinting, right? What is it saying? Lifting weights too, like power lifting. If that's your thing, you like to power lift, you're gonna have a lot more fast glycolytic fibers, right? If your thing is to more like, take 5-hour walks, then you'll have slow oxidative fibers. Don't make sense. All right, guys, so what this picture's showing then is the difference between these. So if they're lighter, what are they lacking? Myoglobin. If they're darker, they got lots of myoglobin. In fact, you guys see this muscle has a mixture of all of them. So when you think about like, in terms of entire muscle, if we call it like white meat or dark meat, you're not going to have one type of fiber in that muscle. It's actually going to be a mixture of fibers. But if you predominantly have the fast glycolytic variety in that muscle, it's going to make the muscle tissue look lighter, right? So in fact, no muscle is going to have one type of fiber. It's going to be a big mix of fiber types. So you have slow oxidative, fast glycolytic. And what's cool is these fibers can switch their type. You can switch from a fast glycolytic type to maybe a fast oxidative, or slow oxidative to a fast oxidative. And so that switching is dependent on how you use the muscle. So remember back in bone, we talked about how bones will mold and change based on how you use them. We talked about how like bony parts can get larger depending on how much you use that, right? Like the external occipital protuberance in your occipital bone could get larger if you use your trapezius more. Well, depending on how you use a muscle, you're also going to change your fiber type. So it makes sense. Now, what this is saying, you guys, is that skeletal muscles usually contain all 3 muscle fibers. A single motor unit usually controls muscle fibers of the same type. And so that means you can actually recruit different motor units to only activate certain types of fibers. Slow fibers you find in postural muscles like your back and calf. And those are mostly have like a continuous state of contraction. And there are no slow muscle fibers in muscles that require swift but brief contractions. That makes sense. Like in the eye and hand. Like if you're going to move your eyeball around, those are only fast fibers, not slow fibers. Because what would happen if your eye muscles were slow fibers? Not necessarily lazy eye, but your eyeball would move much more slowly, right? Like imagine hearing a noise and then trying to look at that where the noise is coming from, and your eyeballs are going, right? Just very slowly. That would be very effective, especially if you're trying to survive. Like if it's a predator or something. Yeah, like very slow. Slow-mo. Exactly. Now, we talked about how if you don't use it, you lose it, right? Same thing in muscle. If you don't use muscle, it atrophies, just like bone does. And if you overuse muscle, then it'll hypertrophy, just like bone does. So muscle atrophy is a wasting of muscle tissue that reduces the size, tone, and power of muscle. It can come from a lack of stimulation, whether it's underuse or damage to nerves that connect that muscle. Hypertrophy is an increase in the muscle fiber size that results from repetitive stimulation of muscle fibers. So you hear about people like, they want to bulk up, they want their muscles to look bigger, so then they go out and use them some way. But they sell those devices. The reason why I say that is they sell those devices that like shock your muscles. So you can be lazy and just like lay on your couch, have this little device that like shocks your muscles, and you can like sit back and like just watch TV while it shocks your muscles to contract, and that way you get a six-pack. It's like the laziest way to gain muscle I've ever heard in my life. Huh? Apparently.
Probably not like to the extreme see. Like
yeah. And I would be surprised if it also gave like an even type of muscle thickness. I kind of doubt that you're evenly shocking all your muscles, so it'd probably cause your abdominal muscles to look more lumpy. Yeah, because you're not evenly using them, right? You might get like one big little lump right here, right? And maybe like some small ones on this side, and then one big lump right there. Like, check out my six-pack. Just lumps. No, skeletal muscles are they're defined based on the shape of their fibers. So like fibers can be in circular arrangements, they can be parallel, they can converge, or they can be pennate. So if they're circular, they actually kind of form a circle, like around the mouth. So orbicularis oris, which you use for kissing and kind of puckering your lips, that's a circular muscle. Parallel muscles include like your rectus abdominis, like your six-pack here. Convergent muscles include ones like your pectoralis major, where these muscle fibers converge onto an insertion. And then pennate is where they kind of fan out like a feather. And you're going to find this commonly like in forearm and leg muscles. They're more pennate. Now, in terms of different types of contractions in skeletal muscles, we have agonists, antagonists, and synergists. An agonist is a muscle that produces a specific movement. So back when we talked about the movements of your synovial joints, we said that there was like, we had abduction and adduction and flexion and extension and hyperextension, right? Then we had supination and pronation and inversion and eversion, right? And lateral rotation and medial rotation. Well, the muscles that do those actions, there's an agonist for that. So we'll learn about this later, but there's like flexors of your forearm, or there are flexors of your wrists. Those are agonists for that particular action or activity, okay? Or there are abductors of your thigh, or adductors of the thigh. So those are all agonists because they perform that specific action. Now, antagonists are ones that actually oppose the action of an agonist. So, for instance, what's the opposite of flexion? Extension. Good. And then what's the opposite of abduction? Adduction. And then the opposite of inversion? Eversion. Good. So that would be an antagonist. So if we talk about how there's flexors of your arm, then an antagonist would be extensors of your arm. So the flexors of your arm would be like biceps brachii, brachialis. Extensors of your arm would be like triceps brachii back here. Okay? And synergists are muscles that actually can perform the same action. So there's not one muscle to perform one action. It turns out there's many muscles that can often perform the same thing. So for instance, like you guys an example of flexion of the arm, right? There's not one flexor muscle of your arm, there's multiple. And that would be a synergist because they help perform the same action. Now, the way that muscles are named is based on their action, where they're found, where they're attached to, what they look like, their size, shape, and how many heads or tendons that they have. Okay? So once we start getting to muscles next week, like identifying ones in the lab, we'll learn about how the muscle names are based on any of these categories, right? So there's one called orbicularis oculi. When you think of oculi, what comes to mind? Eye, right? Orbicularis. Sounds like an orbit or kind of circular, like an orb, right? So orbicularis oculi is a circular muscle that surrounds your orbit. It's involved in kind of like, squinting, if that makes sense. Or what if there's one called sternocleidomastoid, named for the bones it connects to? Sternum, clavicle, and mastoid process. You got it. So that sternocleidomastoid attaches right there. It's on your neck. Yeah. It's a big neck muscle there. Yeah. Or what if there's one called pectoralis major? Well, that's on the chest. Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure what that one's called. There's another one too, you guys. This one's probably on your list, but it's just kind of interesting. There's one called piriformis. Piriform means pear-shaped because this muscle looks like a pear. It's kind of shaped like a pear. So it's piriformis. It's in your gluteal area. In fact, gluteus maximus, right? The gluteal region is your behind, right? So the gluteal muscles, they're named for that particular region. Makes sense, right? Or there's another one on your face called zygomaticus. So zygomaticus major and minor. Guess what bone they attach to? Zygomatic bone, exactly. So they're named based off of their region, what they attach to, or what they look like, or the direction of their fibers. So keep that in mind as you guys go through the muscles, because this will help you tremendously as we go through these muscles. If you think about what the name means, it'll help you learn it. Okay. So what this slide shows then are just sort of muscles that are named by action, specific body area, attachment, orientation, shape, and size, or muscle head. So just kind of keep this stuff in mind as you go through the muscles, and it'll help you learn them much better. Now, we're just going to wrap up this chapter, you guys, talking about cardiac versus smooth muscle. So where do you find skeletal muscle? Attached to bones, skin, or other muscles, right? So where do you find cardiac muscle? The heart and smooth muscle? Hollow organs, like digestive tract, respiratory tract, genitourinary tracts. What's that? Oh, let's go through those. Yeah, so which of these three are voluntary? Skeletal, right? Which ones are involuntary? Cardiac and smooth. Which ones are striated? Skeletal and cardiac. Good. Which one do you find in the walls of hollow organs? Smooth. All right, cool, you guys. So they're all involuntary. There are some skeletal muscles that are involuntary, though.
So like you're talking about your like urinary tract and stuff, like that's different muscles that you.
Yeah, you make a good point. So urinary tract muscles, although you have smooth muscle in the wall of your bladder and other areas of the urinary tract, if you're intentionally urinating, it's not because you're consciously controlling smooth muscle.
Right.
You're actually controlling skeletal muscle that helps you urinate. But that's a great question. So cardiac muscle, you guys you only find in the heart, and you find it in the heart wall. It's striated. The cells have 1 or 2 nuclei. They form a Y shape. All these cells are linked up by intercalated discs, which are full of gap junctions. What was the function of a gap junction? Communication between cells. Nice. And these cardiac muscle cells are also autorhythmic, which basically means they can generate their own action potentials in the absence of your nervous system. So it means your heart can beat without nervous system stimulation. Okay? Now, they're under involuntary control, which means you can't consciously control your heart rate. You can change your emotional state to change your heart rate, like you can meditate or think about something that's maybe exciting to increase your heart rate, but you can't like tell your heart to stop or tell your heart to go faster, right? You could change your emotional state to do that, but that's still involuntary. So what cardiac muscle cells look like is they're short, they're branched, and they're striated. So these stripes are the striations. They're also linked up by intercalated discs, which we see here. And these intercalated discs are basically big aggregations of gap junctions, which allow for currents to spread from one cell to the next. Okay. Now, these cardiac muscle cells typically have like 1 to 2 nuclei, and it's only found in the heart. Now, you're still going to find sarcoplasmic reticulum inside of a cardiac muscle cell. You're still going to find myofibrils. You're still going to find thick and thin filaments. So the way they contract is identical to skeletal muscle. But they're excited differently. So skeletal muscle is excited using neurons from your brain or spinal cord that then shock it, right? Cardiac muscle can actually contract on its own. It doesn't need the nervous system to tell it to contract. It actually can generate its own rhythm of electrical currents at its own rate. Okay. Now, smooth muscle you find in the walls of hollow organs like visceral organs, so digestive tract, urinary tract, reproductive tract, and respiratory tract. You also find it in blood vessels. Why might you want smooth muscle in your blood vessels? Say it again? Ooh, interesting. Yeah, to control body temperature. So back in skin, we learned about how smooth muscle in your blood vessels of your skin can change the shape of a blood vessel to regulate body temperature, right? So if you're hot, what do your blood vessels do? They vasodilate, which can increase blood flow. So that's relaxation of the smooth muscle in that vessel. Or if you're cold, you can vasoconstrict, which reduces blood flow to skin. That way you can preserve your body heat. Now, these cells are short. They say fusiform, which just kind of means spindle-shaped. They have 1 nucleus, no striations. That's why they call it smooth. We have thin filaments that are attached to something called dense bodies. So there are no sarcomeres in smooth muscle cells. They contract differently. They don't contract using sarcomeres. They contract using kind of an odder, like a more odd arrangement of thin filaments or actin filaments. Okay, and they're also under involuntary control, so you can't consciously control smooth muscle. So if you look at a smooth muscle cell, it's kind of spindle-shaped. We have a centrally located nucleus. This is what the sarcomere kind of looks like in a smooth muscle cell. You can see it looks much more differently, right? So you still find a thick filament and thin filaments, but they're arranged in different patterns. And instead of shortening the entire muscle, it actually causes smooth muscle cells to kind of clump up. So these smooth muscle cells clump, which means they're really good at squeezing things. So it makes sense. Like if your digestive tract needs to squeeze food forwardly, these smooth muscle cells can do that. And if your blood vessels need to help constrict and prevent blood flow to different parts of your body, smooth muscle cells can do that too. And we'll talk more about this, you guys, in future chapters in A&P2. So just a comparison of skeletal, cardiac, smooth. Which ones of these are striated? Skeletal, cardiac. Which one do you find in the walls of hollow organs? Smooth, good. And which one is voluntary? Skeletal. Which one do you only find in your heart? Cardiac. Which one has branched cells? Cardiac. Which one doesn't have sarcomeres? Smooth, good. Which one has unbranched cells that are striated? Skeletal. Which one has many nuclei? Skeletal, because skeletal muscle cells can be up to like feet in length. Good. Which one has very short cells? Cardiac and smooth have very short cells. Good. So just kind of think of some comparisons and contrasting information for these muscle types.